Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Report from 2019. This is a movie that, by all accounts, looks like it should be pretty good. It's got a surprisingly star-studded cast and a lot of names attached to it in the production that suggest that it should be in pretty good hands. The cast in particular is filled with people who I think have, at least more than a few, have some genuine acting range and acting chops. And because this has a historical element to it, there's something to be said as well for the casting of people who are still alive or historical figures who we have ample documentation of, in terms of, I've talked before a little bit about how when you portray a real person and your choices and options in terms of how much you want to portray them exactly as they are versus get as close as possible to mimicking them versus give a stylized idea of them. I think I talked about that a bit during Vice, among other things. And so that should all be good signs that this is in good hands. But ultimately, I feel like this movie is a victim of its own time period in cinematic production, as well as just sort of mediocre capabilities in a lot of respects. This is it's framed as a historical drama. And when I talk about the time period this came out, 2019 is sort of the tail end, to my mind, of what I see as a particular era of modern historical drama films. We've watched a few on this show, and a lot of them are probably more well known. Obviously, I've talked about The Big Short before, despite not having watched it for the show specifically. But there's this whole era from, like, I want to say 2009 to 2020-ish is sort of when they started to just suddenly disappear all of a sudden, because that's a whole other discussion. The social and the social things that change how the media products that we consume. But anyway, in terms of close keeping historical dramas, this one is sort of at the tail end of that period, to my mind. It is talking, and it is specifically in the tail end of a period of talking about making movies that talk about the, for want of a better phrase, the post 9/11 era, especially in the United States, and the social and political effects thereof. Now, interestingly, this takes a fairly, I would call it nonpartisan, but we're going to get into the specifics of that later. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into an actual discussion of politics. It's more about how cinematic productions work. It takes a fairly nonpartisan approach, and the topic itself is fairly nonpartisan in terms of the specific thing at hand. Is our main character, is played by Adam Driver, is a sort of a part of an independent inquiry that is not affiliated with a specific political party and was supported by had bipartisan support generally. But it picks into specifically the very difficult topic of the CIA's CIA and associated entities' operations during the, air quotes, war on terror, and the crimes against humanity that were committed. The movie, as you can see from the poster, if I have the right poster up, it's called The Report, but it's stylized as The Torture Report with torture crossed out. because the whole thing around the topic is that the CIA didn't really want to acknowledge their participation in it, and it's the political intrigue in that happened around it, or intrigue is maybe the wrong word, but the political snafu and the oops, everybody was involved in this and everybody doesn't want to admit they were involved in this, is sort of the hook for the whole thing. The problem is I can't tell who this movie is really for. It does not have a particular political skew that I can see. It does not take a particular stance in terms of... It does not take a particularly aggressive stance, I should say, in terms of being like anti-surveillance, anti-torture, pro-human rights, etc., etc. It doesn't have a clear sort of sociopolitical statement to make. It's pretty upfront about the fact that it's just like everybody agrees that torturing people is bad, and we're just going to go on from there. And so it's not really trying to do anything in terms of its structure to convince anyone of its core prospect. At the beginning, it seems like it's supposed to be a bit of a character study that our main character, Adam Driver, it's introduced in media res. The beginning of the movie is in media res, where we're basically seeing that his character has, out of some amount of frustration right at the beginning of the film, perhaps crossed some lines in terms of the bureaucratic procedures and even espionage or treason type of things, in terms of acquiring documents he shouldn't have had or something like that, and releasing them to people he shouldn't have. And so it seems like, especially when you start the movie in media res like that a big chunk of the movie is going to be, okay, how do we reach this point where this character who seems to be earnest and well-meaning all the time gets to a point of potentially ruining their own life by doing something illegal, even if they mean to do it for a good reason. Weirdly, the movie does not really do that at all. The main character is so, despite being a real world person, the main character is so sort of lacking in depth in his portrayal that I did not know his name at the end of the movie. I literally forgot it. I don't think it was said that much in the first place, but that it was not notable. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the portrayals being extremely... I don't want to say the portrayals are mediocre, because I think all of the actors are putting on very good performances. Unfortunately, as I've talked about before, a very good performance of a mediocre writing and direction doesn't go very far, and ultimately comes out pretty bad. I've talked before about how I think Adam Driver is an underrated actor. Clearly, this was not a movie where he was showing his chops at all. Annette Bening, who plays Diane Feinstein, is possibly the only the most visible and notable character for her portrayal, and that might in no small part be because Feinstein is a particularly notable figure in U.S. politics over the last 20 years. And so maybe just cultural knowledge or political knowledge in the U.S. drives some level of like, oh, look who it is. And to that point, like basically the only awards, there were a lot of awards, or a decent chunk of awards that were given to this, or nominated. This movie was nominated for. Almost all of them were for Annette Bening's performance, and I don't even think it's that good. It's just that Annette Bening is a good actor, so she's still doing the best with kind of a mediocre script. And I feel like when you are especially when you frame the whole thing up as a reasonable man gets frustrated with the lack of transparency in his politics and the things he's being told to do or not to do by people higher up than him, and he knows better than to want to go along with them. What was the name of the 3 Days of the Condor? That sort of thing. Like, can be a very compelling narrative, and is an enduring story. The character who is put in a situation out of his own control, and feels the need to do right, sometimes by doing wrong, and becomes vilified in his own right as a result of it. That's an interesting story that can be twisted so many ways. Even for a truly historical drama like this one, where almost all the characters are, supposed to be reasonable facsimiles of their real world counterparts. Like, wouldn't have to make up stories that much to portray a lot more character depth. Adam Driver's character gets like very few scenes where he does anything to indicate his serious qualms about what he's dealing with. And in fact, to that end, doesn't even get as much screen time as it seems like he should. The advertising surrounding this like has him very front and center, and the initial framing of the movie as you watch the first few sections really seems like he's going to be our focal character. And in a way he is, but it ends up being more of an ensemble piece. And actually way more time is spent on things like flashbacks of other characters to their participation or observance of the events that he is investigating. That takes up a substantial amount of the runtime. Now, those scenes are hard. Some of them are just boring. Some of them are political. Some of them are just sort of dull, bureaucratic, kind of whatever. Others are, I'm not going to say some of the worst stuff I've ever seen on screen, but like there is a level of detail and explicitness that they performed in this movie in terms of very visibly showing the tortures being carried out. And they don't really shy away from, like, it's not, really bad, but it's very showing you what exactly it is. And that almost feels like it's trying to go for the thing I was talking about before, of trying to start making a statement about like, oh, these people were awful and what they did was wrong, and et cetera, et cetera. Except for, I don't think there was any, I don't know, maybe I'm skewing it with my own view. I'm sure there are plenty of people who, for some reason, think that it's okay that they that they did horrible things to people in the effort to try and get information. But that's sort of the whole point of the movie and the whole point of the story and the whole point of the 7,000 page report that was written in real life about this whole thing, is that the CIA pretty clearly and provably had no basis to go off of this to think this was working or was legally okay, let alone morally or ethically. So I think if you came into this movie, if you happened to be the kind of person who came into this movie thinking, no, actually the CIA was right all along, this movie wouldn't be the one to change your mind about that. So if we presume that everybody's sort of on board with the idea that torture is bad, then having these very explicit scenes, while gut-wrenching and impressive in terms of their production value, do not really add to the narrative at all. all they do is, I don't know. They really distract from the point. If the point is to tell a story about a character who's struggling against a system that he thinks is not doing justice in the right way or is inadequate in its response, then it distracts from that story. If it's telling a story about rather than a single character, a general purpose a bipartisan cover up of the events because of the foibles of politics and how a whole lot of people have vested interests in not coming to light, then it does an inadequate job of telling that story either, because it manages to frame almost everyone in a relatively positive light. The only exception really being those working in and around the CIA. And even their portrayals are relatively non-villainous. Like, this could definitely have gone a route, for better or for worse, of painting the CIA's operatives as being just like heinous war criminals who just loved being evil. Which wouldn't have probably been particularly accurate, but at least would have maybe made for a slightly more compelling narrative with clear ramifications. But the whole framework around this story ends on a very weird note, because the end of the movie, I'm going to spoil it, but it's not really spoilers. The end of the movie and the end of the reality of this was that the report was released in part, and then nothing really happened. And the movie itself frames the ending of they finally got some like push with bipartisan support to release and acknowledge this report and acknowledge the failures of the government to stop it from happening or to catch it while it was happening. But then, as in the epilogue, in similar fashion to a lot of these other political drama films, or like, economic drama films, whatever, of this ilk that came out in the last 15 years or so, it ends with this epilogue of like text on screen, where it's like it sort of does these more old school, like, this is what happened to these people after the fact, except for right after it presents this like relatively upbeat, oh, actually we did release the report, it then says, and then nothing happened and nobody went to jail and nobody got in trouble and some of them were promoted. And it's a real downer. And like, it should be, because that's what happened. But when the cinematic framework says this was a success because our character got what he wanted because his report that he had worked on for years and years and ruined his own life about, finally came out, like, that dichotomy, the juxtaposition there is so broken and unsatisfying. And on top of all that, like, all of the lead up really didn't make us even, like, we were rooting for his character because he's doing the right thing in trying to expose the injustices done. But you're not really rooting for him that hard because, like, you don't really even know him as a person or as a character. There are allusions to things like, oh, his relationship failed because he was so focused on his work. But, like, you don't even particularly see, other than the most expressive he gets is in a couple of meetings where he kind of loses his temper a little bit and goes, are you kidding me? Is this really what's happening? All of my work is going to, be swept under the rug or whatever. And he gets a little upset, and that's like the most emotion we get out of him. There's no scenes of him like having problems at home. There's no scenes of him having like a personal debate in his office about, like, am I doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Not verbally, but, trying to decide these very difficult questions for himself. That is extremely limited in when it comes up and how it is delivered. And so ultimately, like, you've got all these characters, including our main one, who are not compelling or particularly interesting. And it delivers an interesting story with a lot of avenues for interesting delivery in a way that is very neutral and dull and doesn't say much of anything. I've said before that, like, the worst thing that a piece of media can be is boring. And this movie isn't terrible, but it is boring. I'm just going to make some brief notes about the production itself. This was made on, from the the limited notes I found, this is made for like $8 million. So the budget's not that high for that kind of money, or even for a lot more money. This looks fine. If you told me this was a $40 million movie, I'd say, yeah, that makes sense. Because nothing is technically all that wrong with it, but it is ugly, and it is written, directed, and produced by Scott Burns, who has fairly limited direction credits, but has a bunch more writing credits. It's also produced by Steven Soderbergh, who should know better. But like, I don't even remember. I looked it up just before. Hold on, let me check this. Like, Burns's credits are for like writing Contagion. Oh, also, yeah, wrote The Bourne Ultimatum, which, if I had known that, and but like, I think the only other direction credits are like a British film from 2006, and then a couple of episodes of some TV shows. So I can't speak to his like particular direction chops, but this is sometimes an extremely ugly movie. It does succumb to some of the cliches that came from a slightly earlier era, especially of movies about the war in the Middle East. That, like, everything's very yellow because, you know, how else do we get across that it's hot? But even worse than that are all of the scenes going on in DC. All of these office scenes are like color graded gray and blue. They're incredibly dull and ugly. And possibly the most hilarious one for me is there are a couple of scenes of what's it called? People going in front of going to speak in front of various like Senate committees and things. And all of those scenes are ugly, but one of them in particular, I don't even remember which one at this point, is just so aggressively unlit, or so aggressively stylistically lit, that I couldn't help but laugh at it. I was just going, okay, we've all seen at one point or another one of these, you know, committee meetings on C-SPAN where somebody's, you know, hunched over the desk in front of the little mic where there's like a panel of a dozen or so representatives or senators or whatever who are grilling them on something. And those scenes are always the reality is they're always, you know, very well lit rooms and things like that. Meanwhile, like, all of these scenes are like somebody turned out all the lights in the room and put like the most like put a very soft spotlight on the speaking characters, but the rest of the room is dark. It'd be, if they took an even more aggressive artistic stylistic approach, it could be an interesting choice, but it just looks like somebody forgot to, you know, light the room correctly. And is, I don't know, it skews the whole tone when it's like, oh, you're taking this movie is taking itself more seriously than it should be. Like, it's not that epic. This was just some more political schmucks schmucking it up in a committee room. The rest of it is production wise pretty unremarkable. There are a couple of audio stings, musical stings and things that are bizarrely aggressive for no reason. Other than that, like, most of the production value stuff is completely unnoteworthy or mediocre to bad. It's acceptable. It doesn't offend my eyes, but it's just not good. And if that was the only thing wrong with this film, then maybe I'd, pick at that more, but there's a whole lot that's going wrong. For all the criticism I'm giving this film, like, it's not horrible. And if this was a topic you were really, really interested in, then absolutely, I think this is a decent enough film for, like, portraying it in a pretty reasonable manner. But as far as being like an interesting cinematic experience worth your time on its own, if you're not already, predisposed to be interested in this kind of thing, it's very boring. It's just not very good. It's not particularly grotesquely offensive, and there are certain elements that are kind of impressive, but it's not good. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.